Hi, boys and girls. Today it is time to read chapter 22 in Running Out of Time. And if you recall from yesterday's reading on chapter 21, I think we were at the climax. Just for a quick recap, it says, and the last thing she heard before losing consciousness entirely, well, Bob, if that's diphtheria, you've got your proof. All right, so I think that is the climactic moment in this novel where the reader knows that something is about to change for Jessie. And we could probably make a pretty fair prediction that the next place Jessie's going to go on her journey is probably to the hospital. All right, so if you would turn to page 159, chapter 22 will begin. So for a long time after that, even when Jessie was awake, everything passed in a daze. She was vaguely aware of being in bed, but she didn't know how she had gotten there. Soft hands tended her, sponged her forehead, and turned her on her side, but they weren't Ma's. At first, Jessie had trouble breathing, but then everything was easy. She would have felt totally peaceful, except, Katie, she managed to croak once when she was being turned. Katie, okay? There was no answer. Jessie fell into troubled sleep and dreamed that Mr. Neely and Ray and Toll were chasing her, brandishing giant phones the size of clubs. She woke up confused, but asked herself questions again. Katie, okay? Yes, a voice answered. The next time Jessie woke, she remembered enough to ask more. Others, sick. Ma? Pa? Where? Shh, a voice answered. Just sleep. And Jessie did sleep for days and days, it seems. She didn't know until later that her hospital room was filled with flowers from people who had read and heard about her, and even from some of the reporters who had been at her news conference. She didn't know until later that Katie was sleeping in a bed right next to her. She didn't know until later how many people were arrested partly because of what she said in her news conference. But one morning she woke up and felt almost clear-headed. She looked around the room and saw Katie grinning at her. Jessie, Katie said, is that really you, Jessie? Well, of course, Jessie said. Come and see for yourself. Katie shakenly climbed out of her bed, wobbled toward Jessie, and crawled in with her. I thought you were in a box, Katie said. I was? Jessie said, confused. Katie nodded. The nurses called it a TV. Oh, Jessie suddenly understood. That was like a picture, not real. But you moved, Katie said, and you fell down, and I thought you were trapped. Then they wouldn't let me watch. They took the box away. Oh, Katie, Jessie said, I'm okay now. Katie started to cry anyway. Where are Ma and Pa? No one will tell me. Katie leaned against Jessie, and Jessie smoothed her hair. I'm sure Ma and Pa will come and get us as soon as they can, Jessie said, but she didn't know what Katie meant. Where were Ma and Pa, and why weren't they watching over Katie and Jessie? Who takes care of us? Jessie asked. Nurses and doctors. They're nice, Katie said, but I want Ma. I know. Jessie wasn't sure how much else she could ask without scaring Katie. Have you seen anyone else? Oh, Hannah and Andrew and Nathan and Bartholomew and almost everyone from school, Katie said. So all the Clifton children were in the hospital? But where were the adults? A few days later, when Jessie could stay awake longer, the nurses said she could see two more of her siblings. Jessie chose Hannah and Andrew. They came into her room in strange chairs with wheels on the sides, and they looked odd without their usual Clifton clothes like Jessie and Katie. They both wore gowns that tied in the back. Look, I can do races in this, Andrew bragged, spinning his wheels quickly. But Jessie saw that after only a few spins, he sat back in his chair exhausted. Did Jessie look as pale and sickly as her brother and sister? Do you know where Ma and Pa are? Jessie asked. Hannah and Andrew exchanged glances. No, Hannah said. All we know is that it is really 1996, and there's something wrong with Clifton. No one will tell us anything else. They just ask us questions. Tell her the bad news, too, Andrew said gruffly. Hannah nodded. Jessie, Abby and Jefferson died. Jessie turned away. So she had failed to get help in time after all. She blinked back tears. Hannah rolled her chair beside Jessie's bed. Jessie, I know you went and got help, and you saved all the rest of us, so you shouldn't feel too bad. Oh, shut up, Andrew said roughly, and he rolled his chair back. Jefferson had been one of Andrew's best friends, but Jessie knew Andrew wouldn't let his sister see him cry. Andrew gulped and said in a forced voice, "Don't you want to hear what you missed, with the guns and sirens and all?" It seemed that 2 days after Jessie got sick, or you didn't really get sick then, did you? Hannah said. Mr. Seward had suddenly rushed into the schoolhouse just before lunch. He had his big rifle, and he was waving it around, saying no one would get hurt if we didn't move, Hannah said matter-of-factly. Jessie was amazed at how calm she sounded, considering what a coward Hannah normally was. What did he do? Why'd he do that? Jessie asked. We didn't know then, Andrew said. We thought he was crazy, but it was because of you. Andrew and Hannah took a long time to explain, but eventually Jessie understood. After the news conference, all the reporters started calling Mr. Clifton and the Board of Health. Then the Board of Health called, demanding to be let in, and Mr. Clifton's men got desperate. Mr. Seward took over the schoolhouse, hoping to keep the health officials out. But why, Jessie asked, why didn't they want the sick children to get medicine? That's one of the things no one will tell us, Andrew said. Now shut up. We're almost to the good part. Mr. Seward kept pointing his rifle at the children, Andrew said. Mr. Seward let Mr. Smythe leave, and the children thought he'd go for help. Instead, he came back with another gun. He was on the bad side all along, Andrew said. Jessie was glad. She never liked Mr. Smythe. The schoolhouse was hot, but Mr. Seward wouldn't let anyone go out to the well for a drink, and he didn't let them leave for anything. Not even the outhouse, Hannah said. The children could hear shouting outside, voices they knew like Mr. Whittingham and Mr. Ruddles, trying to convince Mr. Seward to give up. And then those voices stopped, and there were others they didn't recognize, unnaturally loud. This is the Indiana State Police, Andrew imitated in a deep voice. Come out immediately, and you won't be harmed. They had something called a bullhorn, Jessie. Do you know where I can get one? Jessie shook her head. Weren't you all scared? She asked. Well, sure, Andrew said. The girls cried. That's all you could hear was sniff, sniff, sniff. Not all of us cried, Hannah corrected, and some boys did too, the little ones. That's true, Andrew agreed, more charitable than usual. From the shouting and from peeking outside, the children could tell there were lots of men surrounding the school. They wore strange clothes none of the children had ever seen before, dark shirts and pants with shiny helmets. Mr. Seward started sweating a lot, but he wouldn't answer the men outside. Then suddenly he rushed to one of the windows. Go away, he screamed, or I'll shoot them all. And he ducked back away from the window before they could shoot him. And that's when it happened. Tell her, Andrew said to Hannah. Jessie was surprised at the note of admiration in his voice. Andrew usually didn't have much use for Hannah. Hannah looked down demurely. I tripped him. Mr. Seward fell hard because he's the fattest man in Clifton, you know, Andrew said. The rifle clattered across the floor, and Mr. Seward lunged to grab it back, and for a terrible moment it seemed he would, and several of the biggest boys tried to reach it first, and it spun crazily on the floor, and then Chester Seward emerged with the rifle firm in his grasp. Good son, Mr. Seward said. Hand it over to Pa. No, Chester said. You'll hurt Hannah. And he pointed the gun at Mr. Seward, forgetting Mr. Smythe had a gun too. But Mr. Smythe took one look at Chester, dropped his rifle, and ran out of the school. The children could hear him yell, It wasn't me! It wasn't me! Holding the rifle at Mr. Seward's back, Chester walked him out of the school. That was the last time we saw Mr. Seward, Andrew said, or any of the other grown-ups. The ambulance came. You should have heard these things. They have sirens, and they brought all of us children here, even the ones who weren't sick. The nurses said we all had to be under observation. Jessie was still amazed by an earlier part of the story. So Chester liked you after all, she asked Hannah. Yes, Hannah said, smiling softly. Yuck, Andrew said. And you really tripped Mr. Seward? Jessie couldn't believe it. You were that brave? Hannah shook her head. No, I just kept thinking that you would have been brave enough to do it, and you weren't there, so. Jessie started laughing hard. What's so funny? Hannah sounded hurt. When I was leaving Clifton, I tried to be cautious like you. And they all laughed. Hannah looked a little proud. So, what was it like, your trip? Andrew asked. Jessie wanted to brag about her own bravery, but something stopped her. Scary, she said. In fact, though she didn't tell Andrew and Hannah, she still felt scared, even now. All right, thanks for watching. We will continue our falling action when we go on to read chapter 23. Hope you'll join me.